Welcome to Soft Spoken Mysteries. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows of history to explore two of the world's most enigmatic forgotten empires, civilizations that built monuments so magnificent they still inspire awe today, yet vanish so completely that their secrets remained buried for centuries. In our first investigation, we'll journey deep into the jungles of Southeast Asia, where the ruins of a city larger than medieval London lie hidden beneath the trees, a metropolis that once housed nearly 1 million souls, an empire that commanded half of Southeast Asia through sophisticated water engineering and divine kingship, the Khmer Empire and its capital, Angkor, a civilization that ruled for 600 years, then disappeared into the jungle so thoroughly that locals whispered it was only legend until Western explorers stumbled through a narrow canyon and found temples the size of cathedrals carved into living rock. Then we'll cross to the burning deserts of Jordan, where nomadic traders built an empire on frankincense and myrrh. The Nabataeans, who carved an entire city from rose-coloured cliffs, controlled the spice routes for 5 centuries and developed water systems so advanced they turned desert into paradise. Yet these master engineers and shrewd merchants left almost no written records. They guarded their secrets so jealously that even today, we don't know where they came from or where they went. 2 empires, 2 mysterious disappearances, 2 testaments to how even the mightiest civilizations can fade into shadow, leaving only stones and questions behind. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into the forgotten kingdoms that history tried to erase. The jungle breathes. In the dense forests of Cambodia, where the heat sits heavy and the green grows so thick it blocks out the sky, ancient stones sleep beneath strangler figs and creeping vines. Moss-covered faces stare from temple walls, serpent carvings wind around pillars, and everywhere the relentless advance of nature slowly reclaims what humans once carved from the earth. This is Angkor, or what remains of it. But to understand what was lost, we need to go back. Back to the 9th century, when a warrior king named Jayavarman II declared himself not just a ruler, but a god incarnate. The year was 802 CE, and with religious ceremony and political cunning, he founded what would become the Khmer Empire. His capital would be called Angkor, meaning simply the city. But there was nothing simple about what his descendants would build. The Khmer didn't just construct buildings, they engineered a cosmic order in stone. See, the Khmer kings believed themselves to be Devarajas, god kings who served as the earthly manifestation of Hindu deities, primarily Vishnu and Shiva. When a king died, the temple he had built during his lifetime became his immortal body. His spirit would dwell there forever, watching over his people, receiving offerings, maintaining the cosmic balance between the mortal world and the divine. This wasn't metaphor, this was literal truth to the Khmer people, and so each king tried to outdo his predecessors. Bigger temples, more intricate carvings, grander cosmic symbolism. The temples weren't just places of worship, they were the axis mundi, the centre of the universe, the point where heaven and earth touched. Mount Meru, the sacred mountain of Hindu cosmology, recreated in sandstone and laterite. By the 12th century, under King Suryavarman II, the Khmer Empire had reached its absolute zenith of power and architectural ambition. It was during his reign, from 1113 to 1150, that the single, most ambitious temple complex in human history began to rise from the Cambodian plains, Angkor Wat. The name translates to City of Temples, and when you see it, you understand why superlatives fail. The main temple complex alone covers 400 acres. The entire structure sits within a rectangular moat 200 meters wide, symbolizing the cosmic ocean surrounding Mount Meru. To enter, you cross a sandstone causeway stretching nearly a quarter mile. The temple itself rises in 3 enormous tiers, culminating in 5 towers representing the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, the central tower soaring nearly 200 feet into the tropical sky. Here's what makes this even more staggering. Inscriptions from the period claim that building Angkor Wat required 300,000 workers and 6,000 elephants working for 30 years. 30 years of continuous construction. Imagine the organization required. The food, the water, the coordination. This was medieval engineering on a scale that rivaled anything in Europe or the Middle East. But Angkor Wat was just one temple. Just one. The greater city of Angkor stretched across an area larger than all 5 boroughs of modern New York City. At its height, somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million people lived within this sprawling metropolis. To put that in perspective, that's larger than any European city of the same period. London in the 12th century had maybe 25,000 people. Paris perhaps 100,000. Angkor dwarfed them all. How did the Khmer support such an enormous population in the middle of a jungle? Water. The Khmer were master hydraulic engineers. They didn't just build temples, they built one of the most sophisticated water management systems the medieval world had ever seen. A network of canals, reservoirs and dikes that stretched for miles in every direction, capturing monsoon rains, storing water through the dry season, and irrigating enough rice fields to feed nearly 1 million mouths. The largest of these reservoirs, the West Baray, measures 5 miles long and over 1 mile wide. 5 miles. This isn't a pond. This isn't even a lake. This is an inland sea, hand-dug by medieval workers. The reservoir could hold more than 20 million cubic meters of water. That's enough to irrigate thousands of acres of rice paddies to supply the city during droughts, to demonstrate the God King's power over the very elements themselves. And the temples kept coming. King after king, each trying to prove his divine mandate through architectural glory. Bante Samra, built in the mid-12th century, a jewel of classical Khmer architecture, restored in the 1940s, but originally devoted to Vishnu, cloistered inside 2 sets of concentric square walls, possibly once surrounded by a moat symbolizing the cosmic ocean. Ta Prohm, constructed by King Jayavarman VII in the late 12th century as a monastery and university. This temple was enormous. Inscriptions record that it employed 18 high priests, 2,940 officials, and required the services of 625 men and women to maintain it. It owned 340 villages. Think about those numbers. A single temple complex controlling resources equivalent to a small kingdom. Preah Khan, another creation of Jayavarman VII, even larger than Ta Prohm. A temple complex that functioned as both a Buddhist monastery and the headquarters of the king's administration. It had its own university, a hospital, and according to inscriptions at its peak it employed 97,140 attendants and servants. The Bayon, perhaps the most mysterious of all Angkor's temples. Built in the late 12th or early 13th century, it sits at the exact centre of Angkor Thom, the fortified city within the greater Angkor complex. What makes the Bayon unforgettable are the faces. 54 towers, each carved with 4 serene faces looking out in the cardinal directions. 216 faces in total, each over 2 meters tall, each bearing that same enigmatic smile. Are they representations of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara? Are they idealized portraits of Jayavarman VII himself? We still debate the answer. Dozens of major temples, hundreds of smaller shrines, each one a statement of power, piety, and architectural ambition. A city of stone rising from the jungle, maintained by an empire that controlled everything from Myanmar in the west to Vietnam in the east. But let's talk about what life was actually like in Angkor at its height. Because it's easy to focus on temples and kings and forget about the hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who made this civilization function. We know about daily life from several sources. First, there are the bas-reliefs, carved on temple walls, showing scenes of markets, battles, festivals, and everyday activities. Second, There's the account of Zhou Daguan, a Chinese diplomat who visited Angkor in 1296 and wrote extensively about what he observed. And third, there's archaeology, the physical evidence of how people lived. Zhou Daguan described a city of immense wealth and sophistication. He wrote about the royal palace, though it no longer stands because it was built of wood. He described the king appearing in processions on an elephant, preceded by soldiers and followed by hundreds of palace women. Carrying gold and silver vessels, candles and ornaments, the populace would prostrate themselves as the god-king passed. But Zhou also described the markets. Women dominated trade, he noted, which apparently surprised him coming from Confucian China, where women's roles were more restricted. The markets sold rice, fish, meat, vegetables, fruits, wine, and various goods. People used shells as small currency and silver for larger transactions. He described the houses. The common people lived in wooden structures with thatched roofs. Only temples could have tile roofs, a privilege reserved for the gods. But even common houses were apparently well constructed and comfortable, suited to the tropical climate with high ceilings and good ventilation. Zhou wrote about customs that seemed exotic to him. People bathed several times a day, which made sense in that heat. They considered the head sacred and would not touch another person's head. They had complex taboos around who could eat with whom. The elite practiced polygamy, with important men having dozens of wives and concubines. He also noted darker aspects. Slavery was common. War captives and debt slaves served wealthy households. Zhou mentions that some families owned 100 slaves. There was a rigid social hierarchy, with the Khmer elite at the top, free commoners in the middle, and various enslaved and ethnic minority groups at the bottom. The Khmer economy was based primarily on rice agriculture, but it was sophisticated rice agriculture. They practiced 2 or even 3 harvests per year in areas with good water management. They grew floating rice that could tolerate flood conditions. They developed systems of crop rotation and soil management that kept fields productive year after year. Beyond rice, they cultivated vegetables, fruit trees, betel nut, and other crops. They raised pigs, chickens, and water buffalo. They fished extensively, both in the rivers and in the Tonle Sap, the great lake that borders Angkor. The lake was and remains one of the most productive freshwater fisheries in the world, teeming with fish during the wet season. And they traded. Overland routes connected Angkor to China, India, and the ports on the Gulf of Thailand. Chinese merchants came seeking rhinoceros horn, ivory, beeswax, and exotic woods. Indian traders brought textiles and spices. Archaeological excavations have found Chinese ceramics, Indian beads, and goods from as far as the Middle East. The Khmer weren't isolated jungle dwellers. They were participants in the medieval global economy, trading partners with the greatest powers of their age. Their artisans were highly skilled. The stone carving alone demonstrates mastery, but they also worked in bronze, creating elaborate statues of Hindu and Buddhist deities. They carved intricate wooden objects, though few have survived in the tropical climate. They wove silk and cotton textiles. They created jewellery from gold and precious stones. And they developed a written language. Old Khmer descended from Sanskrit, but adapted to their own needs. The inscriptions that cover temple walls, recording donations, royal genealogies, and religious dedications show a literate elite capable of complex written communication. The Khmer had a functioning bureaucratic state. There were officials responsible for water management, for collecting taxes, for administering justice, for organising construction projects. The king sat at the top of this pyramid, but below him was an administrative apparatus that made the empire function. Religion permeated everything. The temples weren't separate from daily life. They were the centres of economic and social activity. People brought offerings, attended festivals, sought blessings from priests. The temples owned land, employed workers, operated as economic centres in their own right. And there was art everywhere. Not just the temples themselves, but the apsaras, the celestial dancers, carved into walls. The narrative bas-reliefs showing scenes from Hindu epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana. The intricate floral patterns, the demon guardians, the cosmic serpents, every surface a canvas for religious and artistic expression. This was the Angkor that thrived from the 9th through 13th centuries. A civilization of impressive sophistication, artistic refinement, and organizational complexity. But here's where the story gets dark, where the mystery deepens. Around the 14th century, something began to change. The inscriptions, which had been so detailed about construction projects and royal deeds, suddenly became scarce, then stopped almost entirely. The last major inscription at Angkor dates to 1327. After that, silence. The Khmer didn't keep extensive written chronicles. Unlike the Chinese or the Arabs, they didn't maintain detailed historical records that survived. So when the inscriptions stopped, our window into their world closed. We're left piecing together their decline from archaeology, from Chinese accounts, from what the stones themselves can tell us. And what they tell us is that Angkor didn't fall suddenly. It eroded, slowly, like the jungle reclaiming stone. Sometime around the late 14th or early 15th century, the Khmer began converting from Hinduism to Theravada Buddhism. This seems minor, but the implications were enormous. Theravada Buddhism emphasized personal meditation, simple shrines, small monasteries. The monks didn't need massive temple mountains. The faithful didn't require elaborate royal ceremonies. The cosmic architecture that had defined Khmer civilization suddenly became irrelevant. When people stopped believing the king was literally a god incarnate, the whole system that supported those massive construction projects collapsed. Why work yourself to death building monuments to a mortal man? Why maintain enormous reservoirs and canals when the religious justification had evaporated? Then came the climate. Recent archaeological work analysing core samples from the moats around Angkor Thom, the walled citadel at Angkor's heart, revealed something chilling. Starting in the early 14th century, pollen deposits decreased dramatically. Charcoal traces vanished, evidence of soil erosion disappeared, all signs pointing to one conclusion: farming stopped. The moats weren't being maintained. Vegetation grew thick over the water. What could cause this? The answer lies in tree rings, in climate data, in the patterns of monsoons across Southeast Asia. Between roughly 1350 and 1430, the region experienced severe climate instability. Decades of devastating drought, punctuated by periods of catastrophic flooding. The monsoon system that the Khmer water management relied upon became unpredictable. Too little rain and the reservoirs ran dry. Too much rain and the canal systems, designed for controlled irrigation, were overwhelmed and damaged. The infrastructure that had been Angkor's greatest strength became its fatal weakness. Those massive barrays and intricate canal networks required constant maintenance. When the climate turned hostile, when the religious justification for maintaining them disappeared, when the labour force scattered, the whole system fell apart. And there was another pressure building on Angkor's borders. To the west, a new power was rising. The Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya, founded in 1351, began expanding eastward. The Thai were aggressive, well-organised, and they controlled access to the Gulf of Thailand, which meant they controlled maritime trade with China. This matters because by the 15th century, maritime trade was exploding. Chinese merchants wanted spices, exotic woods, precious goods from Southeast Asia, but they wanted to trade by sea, not overland. Angkor sat inland, dependent on river commerce. Ayutthaya sat on the coast, perfectly positioned to take advantage of the new trade networks. The Khmer elite saw the writing on the wall. Why stay in Angkor, maintaining an expensive, drought-vulnerable inland city, when you could move southeast to the banks of the Mekong River, closer to the sea, closer to trade, closer to wealth? These new settlements, offered access to burgeoning international trade networks, while Angkor faced territorial disputes with the Thai and environmental collapse. In 1431, Thai forces from Ayutthaya sacked Angkor. But here's the thing. This wasn't the cause of Angkor's fall. This was the culmination of a century-long decline. Archaeological evidence shows the city had been gradually depopulating for decades before the Thai attack. The elite had already left. The temples were already falling into disrepair. The attack just puts an official end to what was already a ghost city, and then Angkor disappeared. Not literally, of course. The temples remained. The stones didn't crumble overnight, but Angkor ceased to be the centre of Khmer civilization. The capital moved to Longvek, then to Phnom Penh. The jungle, so long held back by human effort, surged forward. Strangler figs wrapped around pillars, roots split stones, vines covered carvings. Within a few generations, Angkor transformed from a living city into a mysterious ruin. The local Khmer people never forgot about Angkor. They told stories of it. Fishermen and farmers knew it was there. But to the outside world, it might as well have been myth. Until 1860. That's when French naturalist Henri Mouhot made his way through the Cambodian jungle and emerged into the courtyard before Angkor Wat. His descriptions, published in Le Tour du Monde, awakened Western interest in the ruins. Suddenly, Angkor became an archaeological obsession. European scholars couldn't believe that such sophisticated architecture existed in Southeast Asia. Some refused to believe the Khmer had built it at all, attributing the temples to lost Roman colonists or ancient visitors from Alexander the Great's empire. This colonial arrogance persisted for decades. The idea that savage Southeast Asians could have engineered such marvels seemed impossible to Western minds. Never mind that Angkor Wat demonstrates mathematical precision and astronomical knowledge equal to anything medieval Europe produced. Never mind the hydraulic engineering that puts medieval European water systems to shame. The racism of the Victorian era couldn't accept that a non-European civilization might have been more advanced than contemporary Europe in the 12th century. But the stones don't lie, and modern archaeology, free from colonial prejudice, has revealed the truth. The Khmer Empire was a marvel of medieval engineering, urban planning, and artistic achievement. So what really destroyed Angkor? Was it climate? Was it religious change? Was it economics? Was it the Thai invasion? The answer is all of them. And none of them. Civilizations rarely fall from a single cause. They collapse when multiple pressures converge. Environmental stress weakens the infrastructure. Religious change undermines the political system. Economic shifts favor other locations. Military pressure from rivals exploits the existing weakness. It's systemic failure, not dramatic catastrophe. Angkor fell the way most empires fall, gradually, then all at once. But here's what haunts me about Angkor. Here's what keeps archaeologists working in those jungles even today. We still don't fully understand how it worked. In 2007, archaeologists Damien Evans and Roland Fletcher began using LiDAR technology to map the jungle around Angkor. LiDAR uses laser pulses to see through dense vegetation, revealing the ground topology beneath. What they found was staggering. Angkor wasn't just a temple complex. It was a sprawling urban landscape with roads, neighborhoods, canals, and reservoirs extending far beyond what anyone had previously mapped. The city was massive, truly massive, and it was integrated into the landscape in ways we're still trying to understand. The temples weren't isolated monuments. They were nodes in a vast network of water management, urban planning, and cosmic symbolism. Recent excavations have found evidence of sophisticated metallurgy, glassmaking, textile production, trade goods from China, India, and the Middle East. This wasn't a primitive jungle society. This was a cosmopolitan medieval empire engaged in international commerce, producing art that rivals the Renaissance, engineering structures that modern contractors study with respect. And we're still finding things. In 2015, archaeologists discovered a massive statue buried beneath Angkor Wat. In 2020, using ground-penetrating radar, they found previously unknown structures beneath the jungle. Every year brings new discoveries, new mysteries, new questions about what the Khmer achieved and how they did it. The Khmer Empire built a civilization in one of the most challenging environments on Earth and made it thrive for 600 years. They demonstrated that with ingenuity, organization, and sheer determination, humans can reshape even the jungle itself. And then they walked away, left their cosmic architecture to the trees, moved on. The temples remain, silent, covered in moss, slowly being devoured by the forest. But they remain, testaments to an empire that refused to be completely forgotten, no matter how thoroughly the jungle tried to erase it. Now let's shift our gaze from the green hell of Cambodia to a different kind of hell entirely. The burning desert of Jordan, where rock is rose-coloured and water is more precious than gold. In the early 19th century, a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt found himself in a difficult position. He was trying to reach the tomb of Aaron, brother of Moses, said to be located atop a mountain called Jebel Haroun in southern Jordan. But the local Bedouin tribes were deeply suspicious of foreigners. Christians weren't welcome in their territory. Europeans even less so. So Burckhardt did what any dedicated scholar would do. He disguised himself as a Muslim merchant, took the name Ibrahim ibn Abdullah, learned Arabic, studied Islamic customs, and convinced a local guide that he was a pious pilgrim seeking to make a sacrifice at Aaron's tomb. The guide agreed, but with conditions. They would take a specific route through the valley. They would move quickly, and Burckhardt, playing his role as Ibrahim, would ask no suspicious questions. On August 22, 1812, Burckhardt followed his guide into a narrow gorge. The walls rose 100 metres on either side, sometimes pinching so close together that he could barely pass with his camel. The path twisted and turned through the rose-coloured sandstone, the rock showing striations of red, orange, pink, and cream. The Bedouin called this crack in the mountain the Seek. And then, after walking through shadow for more than a kilometre, Burckhardt emerged into blinding sunlight and saw something that stopped his breath. Rising before him, carved directly from the living rock, was a facade of impossible grandeur, columns 2 stories tall, an ornate pediment, intricate decorative elements sculpted with precision that seemed to defy the limitations of ancient tools. The entire structure glowed rose-red in the desert sun, the sandstone seeming to shift colour from pink to orange to deep crimson, depending on the light. This was Al-Khazne, the treasury, the most famous structure in the lost city of Petra. Burckhardt knew he had found something extraordinary, but he also knew his disguise was fragile. He couldn't openly examine the ruins, couldn't take measurements, couldn't sketch details. He sacrificed his goat at Aaron's tomb as planned, made careful mental notes of everything he saw, and left as quickly as his guide demanded. But he had glimpsed what the Western world had forgotten for more than 1,000 years, the capital of the Nabataean kingdom, the rose-red city, half as old as time itself. Who were the Nabataeans? Where did they come from? How did desert nomads build an empire wealthy enough to rival Rome itself? These are questions that still perplex historians because the Nabataeans were obsessively secretive. They left almost no written records, no chronicles of their kings, no historical narratives. What we know about them comes from the observations of outsiders, Greeks and Romans, who traded with them, fought them, and eventually absorbed them. The earliest references to the Nabataeans appear in the 4th century BCE, when Greek historians mention them as fierce desert warriors who controlled the frankincense and myrrh trade routes from Arabia to the Mediterranean. The Greek general Antigonus the One-Eyed tried to conquer them in 312 BCE. His forces expected an easy victory over primitive nomads. The Nabataeans slaughtered nearly 4,600 Greek soldiers. This wasn't luck. This was sophisticated desert warfare. The Nabataeans knew every water source, every hidden path, every tactical advantage the desert provided. They were expert horsemen and camel riders. They could appear from nowhere, strike with devastating force, and vanish back into the wasteland before the enemy could regroup. But the Nabataeans weren't just warriors, they were merchants, and they understood something fundamental about power in the ancient world. Control the luxury goods, control the wealth. Frankincense and myrrh, those biblical spices burned in temples from Jerusalem to Rome, grew only in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. To reach the Mediterranean markets, these precious resins had to cross hundreds of miles of brutal deserts. Whoever controlled that trade route controlled a commodity more valuable than gold. But let's talk about what frankincense and myrrh actually were, and why they commanded such extraordinary prices. Frankincense is a resin harvested from boswellia trees that grow in the mountains of southern Arabia and Somalia. You make careful cuts in the bark, and the tree weeps a milky sap that hardens into tear-shaped droplets. These droplets, when burned, produce a sweet woody smoke that was essential to religious ceremonies across the ancient world. Every major temple in the Mediterranean world burned frankincense. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem used it in sacred incense. Roman temples burned it for the gods. Egyptian priests used it in mummification. The demand was enormous and constant. Myrrh came from similar trees and was equally precious. It was used in perfumes, medicines, and religious rites. The Egyptians included it in embalming mixtures. The Greeks and Romans used it as an antiseptic and pain reliever. In the Bible, it's mentioned alongside gold as one of the gifts the Magi brought to the infant Jesus. That's how valuable it was. And to get these resins from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean markets required crossing some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, where temperatures can reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Mountains where bandits waited to ambush caravans. Waterless stretches where a lost trail meant death. The Nabataeans made this journey not just possible, but reliable. They developed an extensive knowledge of desert geography that they guarded jealously. They knew where every water source was, every hidden spring, every seasonal pool. They built a network of way stations across their territory where caravans could rest, resupply, and water their animals. But here's the brilliant part. They hid these water sources from outsiders, or they controlled them so completely that no one could use the routes without paying the Nabataeans. Ancient sources describe Nabataean cisterns carved into rock faces, hidden in canyons, accessible only to those who knew exactly where to look. This gave them a monopoly that went beyond simple transport. You couldn't cross the desert without the Nabataeans. You couldn't even try. Not safely, not reliably, not if you valued your life and your goods. And they maintained this monopoly for centuries through a combination of desert expertise, commercial shrewdness, and when necessary, ruthless violence against anyone who threatened their trade routes. The Nabataeans made themselves indispensable. They didn't just transport the goods. They provided security, navigation, water, rest stops, everything a caravan needed to survive the crossing. And they charged handsomely for it. Ancient sources claim they took a 25% commission on every shipment. Some historians believe the rate was even higher for particularly valuable goods. Imagine the wealth. Thousands of camels loaded with frankincense worth its weight in silver, passing through Nabataean-controlled territory year after year, decade after decade. Quarter of the value going to the Nabataeans as their fee. They became staggeringly, obscenely rich, and they invested that wealth in developing more sophisticated infrastructure, better cisterns, more way stations, improved breeding of camels specifically for long desert crossings. They developed a breed called the dromedary, the single-humped Arabian camel, perfectly adapted to desert conditions. They also developed extensive knowledge of astronomy for navigation. In the desert, where landmarks disappear in sandstorms and the landscape shifts, the stars are your most reliable guide. The Nabataeans became expert at celestial navigation, reading the night sky to keep their caravans on course. But here's what's remarkable. For centuries, they lived in tents. They remained nomadic. Roman historian Diodorus Siculus, writing around 50 BCE, describes the Nabataeans as refusing to build permanent houses, plant crops, or drink wine. They considered these things the beginning of slavery, the loss of freedom. They had a law, according to Diodorus, that anyone who built a house would be put to death. Anyone who planted crops would face the same penalty. The desert was freedom. Permanence was captivity. They valued mobility above comfort. The ability to pack up and disappear into the wasteland if threatened was more precious than any luxury civilization could offer. But that philosophy couldn't last forever. Not when you're accumulating that much wealth. Not when you're dealing with sophisticated Greek and Roman merchants who expect formal agreements, written contracts, permanent trading posts. Sometime around the 1st century BCE, the Nabataeans made a decision that must have caused tremendous cultural tension. They would build a permanent capital, not in the open desert where their enemies could find it, but in a hidden canyon, a natural fortress that preserved the defensibility they valued while allowing them to create something magnificent. They chose Petra. And here's where the mystery deepens, because we don't really understand the transition from nomadic freedom to urban civilization. The archaeological record shows a relatively sudden appearance of monumental architecture. Within a few generations, the Nabataeans went from living in tents to carving elaborate rock-cut tombs and temples. Who taught them the techniques? Where did they learn to carve stone with such precision? The most likely answer is that they hired craftsmen from elsewhere, Greeks or Egyptians or Phoenicians with experience in monumental construction. But the Nabataean style that emerged was unique, blending Hellenistic, Egyptian, and indigenous Arabian elements into something new. The treasury, for instance, shows clear Greek influence in its Corinthian columns and classical pediment. But look closer, and you see Egyptian elements, Nabataean geometric patterns, and decorative choices that don't fit neatly into any single tradition. It's syncretistic, a fusion of styles from across the ancient world, filtered through Nabataean aesthetic preferences. And they didn't just copy, they innovated the technique of carving from the top down, removing stone progressively, while creating finished surfaces as they went required extraordinary planning. You couldn't sketch it on paper and adjust as you built. You had to visualize the entire structure in 3 dimensions before you made the first cut. One mistake, one miscalculation, and you'd have to abandon the whole project or incorporate the error into the design. Yet the major tombs and temples at Petra show remarkably few errors. The proportions are correct. The columns are evenly spaced. The decorative elements are symmetrical. This suggests a sophisticated understanding of geometry, architectural planning, and artistic vision. The Nabataeans, despite their nomadic origins, had become world-class architects and engineers. Imagine the wealth. Thousands of camels, loaded with frankincense worth its weight in silver, passing through Nabataean-controlled territory year after year, decade after decade. The Nabataeans became staggeringly rich, but here's what's remarkable. For centuries, they lived in tents. They remained nomadic. Roman historian Diodorus Siculus, writing around 50 BCE, describes the Nabataeans as refusing to build permanent houses, plant crops, or drink wine. They considered these things the beginning of slavery, the loss of freedom. They valued the desert, the vastness, the mobility, the ability to disappear when threatened. So when they finally decided to build a permanent capital city, they chose a location that preserved their greatest advantage: defensibility, secrecy, control. Petra sits in a natural fortress of rock. The only practical entrance is through the Sikhu, that narrow canyon Burckhardt walked through. One man could defend that passage against an army. The surrounding cliffs made the city virtually invisible from a distance. You could stand a mile away and never know it was there. But inside the canyon, protected by stone, with access to hidden springs and careful water management, the Nabataeans carved a city that would make their neighbours weep with envy. And I do mean carved. The treasury, spectacular as it is just the beginning. Petra contains more than 800 individual structures carved directly from the sandstone cliffs. Tombs, houses, temples, monasteries, administrative buildings, even a theatre that could seat 8,500 people, all excavated from solid rock. Think about that for a moment. To create the treasury alone required removing thousands of tons of sandstone. But they didn't have explosives. They had chisels, probably bronze and iron tools, though we're not entirely certain because the Nabataeans guarded their techniques jealously. They worked from the top down, scaffolding against the cliff face, carving columns and pediments and decorative elements with precision that still awes modern stonemasons. The facade of the treasury stands 40 meters tall. That's about 13 stories. Every detail had to be carved in place. You couldn't make a mistake and replace a piece. You couldn't take it to a workshop and refine it. The rock was the building. Error was permanent. Yet the columns are perfectly proportional. The decorative elements symmetrical. The overall composition balanced and harmonious. This wasn't crude hacking at stone. This was sophisticated architecture, executed with mastery. And the treasury is just one structure, just one tomb, probably built for Nabataean king Aretas IV in the 1st century CE. Walk deeper into Petra, and you find the street of facades, a row of elaborate tomb fronts, the monastery even larger than the treasury, the royal tombs, enormous and colourful, the striated sandstone, creating natural artwork across their surfaces. The Nabataeans turned their necropolis into a masterpiece. But Petra wasn't just about impressive rock cutting. It was about survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And that meant water. Petra sits in an arid region that receives maybe 6 inches of rain per year. That's barely enough to support scrub vegetation, let alone a city of 20,000 to 30,000 people, which is what Petra grew to at its height. So how did they do it? The Nabataeans developed one of the most sophisticated water management systems of the ancient world. They carved channels directly into the rock faces, creating an elaborate network of aqueducts that captured water from springs in the surrounding mountains. They built cisterns that stored rainwater during the brief wet season. They lined channels with waterproof cement to prevent seepage. Along the Siku, you can still see the ancient water channels carved into the cliff faces on both sides. These channels brought water from springs located kilometers away, using gravity flow and precise engineering to maintain the right gradient. Too steep, and the water flows too fast, eroding the channels. Too shallow, and the water stagnates. The Nabataeans got it exactly right. Inside the city, they built a massive dam to protect Petra from flash floods, which in desert regions can turn dry wadis into raging torrents in minutes. They constructed settling basins to filter sediment from water. They even had a pressurized pipe system using clay pipes sealed with mortar that could carry water uphill for short distances. This was Roman-level hydraulic engineering, maybe better, and the Nabataeans developed it independently, in the middle of a desert, because survival demanded it. With water secured, Petra flourished. By the 1st century CE, the Nabataeans controlled trade routes from Arabia to Syria, from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Their caravans brought frankincense, myrrh, spices, silk, and precious goods from as far as India and China. The Nabataean kingdom became wealthy beyond imagination. King Aretas IV, who ruled from 9 BCE to 40 CE, minted coins that circulated throughout the Middle East. He controlled Damascus at one point. The Nabataean kingdom bordered the Roman Empire, and Rome recognized them as equals, signing treaties rather than attempting conquest. Not because Rome couldn't defeat them militarily, Rome could crush anyone eventually, but because the Nabataeans made themselves valuable. They provided exotic goods Rome wanted. They kept the desert trade routes flowing. They served as a buffer between Rome and the hostile tribes of Arabia. It was easier to trade with the Nabataeans than to conquer them. But that arrangement couldn't last forever. By the late 1st century CE, things were changing. Rome had conquered Egypt. They'd taken Syria. The Nabataean kingdom found itself surrounded by Roman territory. And Rome was developing new trade routes, maritime paths that bypassed the overland desert crossings the Nabataeans controlled. When the last Nabataean king, Rabel-Tut, died in 106 CE, Roman Emperor Trajan decided it was time. The Nabataean kingdom was officially annexed, becoming the Roman province of Arabia Petra. Now Roman sources claim this happened peacefully. They say the Nabataeans simply accepted Roman rule without resistance. But recent archaeological evidence suggests otherwise. There are signs of hurried fortification work at Petra dating to the early 2nd century, evidence of fire, damage to structures that seems consistent with conflict rather than earthquake. And remember, the Nabataeans had a long history of fierce independence. These were the people who killed 4,600 Greek soldiers rather than surrender. Does it really make sense they'd roll over for Rome without a fight? More likely, there was resistance, guerrilla warfare in the desert, the kind of hit-and-run tactics the Nabataeans excelled at. But Rome was patient. Rome was methodical. Rome had legions and supply lines and an empire's worth of resources. Eventually, the Nabataeans were absorbed, but not destroyed. Not yet. Petra continued as a Roman city for centuries. The Nabataeans adapted. They built Roman-style buildings alongside their rock-cut tombs. They minted coins with Roman emperors. They participated in the empire. Then in 363 CE, disaster struck. A massive earthquake shattered the region. Buildings collapsed. The sophisticated water system, so carefully maintained for centuries, was severely damaged. Many of the freestanding structures in Petra's centre were reduced to rubble. The city could have rebuilt. Other cities recovered from earthquakes, but Petra had another problem. Those maritime trade routes Rome had developed, they'd become the dominant way to transport goods. Ships could carry far more cargo than camel caravans, and they could do it faster and cheaper. Petra's whole reason for existence, its control of the desert trade routes, had become obsolete. So people left. Gradually, the population declined. By the 7th century, when the region fell to Muslim armies, Petra was barely inhabited. The magnificent, rock-cut city became a curiosity, a place where Bedouin shepherds sheltered their flocks in tombs built for kings. And then it disappeared from Western knowledge entirely. The Crusaders built a fortress at Petra in the 12th century, but they knew it as a strategic position, not as the lost Nabataean capital. After the Crusades ended, Petra faded even from that limited recognition. By the time Burckhardt found it in 1812, no European had set eyes on the treasury in over 500 years. Since then, archaeologists have worked to uncover Petra's secrets. They've mapped the city, excavated tombs, analysed inscriptions, used ground-penetrating radar to find structures still hidden beneath the sand. And just recently, in August 2024, a team working beneath the treasury made a stunning discovery. A secret tomb, hidden directly below the famous facade, about 4 meters deep. The discovery came about because archaeologists had been using ground-penetrating radar to survey the area in front of the treasury. For years, they'd suspected there might be structures beneath the sand. But excavation in such a sensitive archaeological site requires extensive permissions and careful planning. The team was led by Dr. Pierce Paul Kriesman, Executive Director of the American Center of Research, working in collaboration with Jordanian authorities. They were actually being filmed for the television show Expedition Unknown when they made the breakthrough. The radar had revealed anomalies beneath the left side of the treasury's courtyard, geometric shapes that didn't match natural rock formations, possible chambers, possible artifacts. But you don't know until you dig. And when they dug, they found the impossible. A burial chamber, completely intact, untouched for approximately 2,000 years. Inside, 12 complete human skeletons arranged in a specific pattern. Around them, grave goods of bronze, ceramic, and iron. The condition of the artifacts was extraordinary, protected from the elements by the sealed chamber. Dr. Kriesman called it one of the most significant finds in Petra's modern archaeological history. And he's not exaggerating. Intact Nabataean burials are rare. Most tombs at Petra were looted in antiquity or used for shelter by later inhabitants, disturbing the original contents. Finding 12 individuals buried together, with their grave goods still in place, offers a unique window into Nabataean burial practices and social organisation. The big questions now are, who were these people? Why were they buried together? What was their relationship to the treasury itself? One theory is that they might be members of the Nabataean royal family. The treasury is believed to have been built as a royal tomb, possibly for King Aretas IV, who ruled around 9 BCE to 40 CE. These 12 individuals might be family members, important officials, or even sacrificial burials meant to accompany the king into the afterlife. But that's speculation. The real answers will come from careful analysis of the bones, the artifacts, and the context. DNA testing might reveal family relationships. Isotope analysis of teeth can show where people grew up, what they ate, how they lived. The artifacts will need to be catalogued, studied, compared to other Nabataean finds. This kind of discovery is why archaeologists keep working at Petra, even though it's been studied for over 200 years. Because we're still finding things, still uncovering secrets. The Nabataeans remain mysterious, but every new discovery brings us closer to understanding them. And it's not just Petra. Across Jordan, archaeologists are finding more Nabataean sites, trading posts along the old caravan routes, hilltop fortresses, agricultural settlements where the Nabataeans developed sophisticated terracing systems to farm the desert slopes. We're learning that the Nabataean kingdom was far more extensive and complex than we realized. They weren't just the builders of Petra, they were a regional power with a sophisticated culture that we're only beginning to appreciate. The Nabataeans left us monuments, but few answers. We don't know where they originally came from. Some scholars suggest they were Arabian nomads, others theorize they might have been Persian colonists. There's even a fringe theory they were a lost tribe of Israel, though evidence for that is thin. We don't know how they learned to carve stone with such precision. Who taught them? Where did they develop the techniques? Did they have guilds of master stonemasons passing down knowledge? We have no records. We don't know exactly how their society was organized. Greek sources say they had kings, but also a strong democratic spirit. What does that mean in practice? How did their government actually function? We don't know their full history. The coins and inscriptions give us names and dates, but not the stories. Not the conflicts and alliances and personal dramas that make history human. The Nabataeans kept their secrets well. Even in death, even carved in imperishable stone, they remain mysterious. But here's what we do know. Here's what the stones themselves proclaim. The Nabataeans were brilliant engineers who turned one of Earth's harshest environments into a thriving city. They were shrewd merchants who built an empire on trade routes and secrecy. They were artists who carved beauty from raw cliffs. They were survivors who resisted Greek conquest, negotiated with Rome as equals, and left behind monuments that have endured for 2 millennia. And then, like Angkor, like so many civilizations before and since, they faded. Their language disappeared. Their customs vanished into the practices of conquerors. Their secrets went with them to graves carved in stone. Petra remains. The treasury still glows rose-red in the desert sun. The monastery still crowns its mountain. The tombs still line the wadis, empty now. Their occupants, long since dust. Tourists walk the Sikh today, emerging into that same courtyard where Burckhardt first saw the treasury, experiencing that same moment of awe and wonder. The city is no longer lost. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's one of the new 7 wonders of the world, but the Nabataeans themselves remain lost, shadowy figures who built magnificence and vanished into time. 2 empires tonight, the Khmer and the Nabataeans, one in jungle, one in desert, one building cosmic order in stone and water, the other carving impossible beauty from rose-coloured cliffs. Both demonstrated human capability at its finest, the ability to take inhospitable environments and create thriving civilizations. The Khmer turned jungle into a city of 1 million souls. The Nabataeans transformed desert into an oasis of culture and commerce. Both showed us that civilizations rise through ingenuity, organization, and adaptation to their environment. The Khmer mastered water in a land that alternated between flood and drought. The Nabataeans mastered stone and scarcity in a land that offered little but rock and sun. And both empires remind us that nothing is permanent. No matter how mighty, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how beautiful. The jungle reclaimed Angkor, the desert buried Petra. Time and change erode even stone, but the monuments endure, weathered, incomplete, often misunderstood, but enduring, and they whisper to us across the centuries. They tell us that humans have always been capable of greatness, that our ancestors were every bit as clever, as ambitious, as creative as we are, that civilizations we've never heard of achieved marvels that still inspire awe. They also whisper warnings about environmental limits, about the fragility of complex systems, about how quickly the mighty can fall when multiple pressures converge. Angkor fell when climate, religion, and economics all shifted at once. Petra faded when trade routes changed and earthquakes damaged infrastructure. Neither civilization was destroyed by a single catastrophe. They eroded, gradually, until the weight of accumulated challenges became too much to bear. It's a pattern we see again and again throughout history. And perhaps it's a pattern worth remembering in our own age of complex systems and mounting pressures. But for tonight, we simply remember them. The Khmer who built temples reaching toward heaven. The Nabataeans who carved beauty from stone. 2 forgotten empires, 2 mysterious disappearances, 2 testaments to human achievement and human impermanence. The shadows of history hold many secrets, but sometimes, if we listen carefully to the stones, we can hear echoes of the civilizations that built them. Whispers of the people who walked those streets, fragments of the dreams they carved and the ambitions they pursued. Angkor and Petra remain, silent sentinels in jungle and desert, monuments to empires that refuse to be completely forgotten. And perhaps that's the true victory over time, not to endure unchanged, but to leave something behind that makes the future wonder. That makes us ask questions. That reminds us we're part of a story much larger than ourselves. The empires fell, the cities faded, but the stones remember, and through them, so do we. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the forgotten kingdoms of the past. Tomorrow brings a new mystery, a new investigation into history's hidden corners. Until then, sleep well, and let the whispers of ancient stones fill your dreams with wonder.